Welcome back to House Church, everyone. I'm Jared Anderson, and this is Engaging Gospel Doctrine, episode 365, which covers the Come Follow Me House Church material for April 19th. I've titled this No Other Way. This is Book of Mormon, week 14, that covers Mosiah chapters 1 through 3. Here's my plan. I am going to record and post this episode on Mosiah 1 through 3, and then I will record and post the episode on Jacob 5. It's already fully prepped. And then by tomorrow, I will record and post episode for next week on Mosiah 4 through 6. Technology update. I'm going to try this lapel microphone that you probably don't see unless you're looking really carefully for a more dynamic experience. And we'll see how that goes. For this episode, we will do our COVID check-in and then cover house church, hymn, prayer, sacrament, and the lesson. For the lesson, I want to talk about human nature and divine nature, which is perhaps my favorite topic. Damnation, yeah, it's in the reading, so we have to talk about it. Exclusivity, interconnection, and then I will share a devotion and conclude. COVID check-in. I recommend following my friend James Carroll, who provides substantial, detailed daily updates. He's a statistician. He's very good at what he does. And so I'm going to read this one on what the goal is to getting life back to normal, which is a mixture of vaccination and herd immunity. Herd immunity is what we need for life to be fully back to normal, as much as the new normal will be. So this is his post. Daily update, herd immunity, percentage infected, and R. Let's talk today about herd immunity, the number of population that we would expect to get COVID-19 with and without social distancing. I prefer physical distancing to social distancing, as I've said before. There is a sense that we either do one or the other, that we rely on herd immunity or we rely on social distancing. If we rely on herd immunity, then most everyone will need to get the disease, and if we rely on social distancing, then herd immunity plays no role whatsoever. But neither is true. I have been guilty of the latter mistake myself. What actually happens is that the number of people who are immune adds to the effect of social distancing, lowering the R value, the number of people each infected person tends to infect. The R value of a disease predicts the percentage of the population that has to be infected before herd immunity reaches its tipping point. Defining terms, R0 or R0 is the number of new people infected by a given infected person on average without any social mitigations and in a fully susceptible population. This is a function of how the disease spreads. We will call the R value with some social distancing in a fully susceptible population RS, the socially distanced R, and then R is the actual R value with social distancing and with a fraction of the population that are immune. When the total R is above 1, the disease grows exponentially, exploding at a remarkable rate, infecting massive amounts of people in a shockingly short time frame. When the R is below 1, the disease shrinks exponentially, ironically fulfilling the Trump prediction of magically vanishing in a remarkably short time. But the R value also predicts what percentage of the population will need to get the disease before it stops growing exponentially. Let's give a simple example. If the R value is 2, then each infected person infects 2 others, doubling each generation. And the doubling rate will depend on how quickly those infections happen on average. But if 50% of the population have already had the disease and are immune, then on average, one of the 2 people that are infected each infected person exposes is immune, and the disease is at a tipping point. If anything over 50% are infected, the disease will begin to shrink exponentially. If the R value is 3, then the tipping point is around 66.7%. So in this case, which means, I think it doubles every 3 days. So in this, or each person infects 3 people. That's really scary. So in this case, around 66.7% of the population needs to be immune before the disease begins to shrink exponentially. Something more than the tipping point will usually end up being infected. But I think we can assume it won't be a lot more. Exponentially shrinking functions are just as shocking in how quickly they change as are exponentially growing functions. So we wouldn't expect a lot more than this tipping point to end up infected. As a further example, the flu has an R-0 value of about 1.3, so we would predict that herd immunity would kick in at a tipping point of around 23% infected. But the CDC estimates that on average about 8% of the US population gets sick with the flu each season. As I understand this, the lower number actually infected each season is because of vaccination, and because each season we already have some immunity to different flu strains from previous seasons. COVID-19 worst case scenario. Where does the herd immunity begin for COVID-19? With no social mitigation or social distancing, we think that the R-0 value of COVID-19 is somewhere between 2 and 3. That means we should expect between 50 to 66.7% of the population to be infected before we reach the tipping point where the disease goes away on its own. That is a lower estimate than my original estimate of 75%, and it would cause me to downgrade my initial estimate of how many dead we would expect from COVID-19 without mitigation efforts. This means that without any social distancing efforts and with a population size in the US of 328.2 million, we would expect somewhere between 165 million and 219 million people in the US to catch the disease before we reach a tipping point. And then something only slightly more than that would end up catching the disease before it goes away on its own. With an estimated mortality rate of 1.7%, we would therefore expect between 2.7 million and 3.7 million deaths. I'll read that again. This is why we are physical distancing. This is why we're wearing masks. This is why we are quarantining the best we can. With an estimated mortality rate of 1.7, we would therefore expect between 2.7 million and 3.7 million deaths. But there is also the uncertainty on the true infection mortality rate. If we assume a range between 0.5% at the low end, this is Iceland's unrealistic low mortality rate. My favorite joke is because they're Vikings. To a 4% at the high end, which is the worst case of what can happen when hospitals are overrun, then the range of deaths without social distancing is 821,000 at the low end to 8.8 million at the high end. Again, this is why we're doing everything that we're doing. But this is the worst case scenario without any social distancing. What happens with imperfect social distancing? Imperfect social distancing is what we are actually doing right now in the United States. That's my commentary. Many people, myself included, this is back to James, have assumed that to prevent this worst case scenario, we must achieve an R value below 1 with social distancing. However, what happens if we can't do that? This is an essential question because it has bearing on what happens when we try to reopen the economy. Remember, social distancing is not an either-or proposition. It is possible to reopen many businesses, continue to ban large gatherings, and implement face coverings, wash your hands, stay home if sick, and let as many people as possible work from home, etc., all allowing a basically open economy without actually returning to the R-0 value. R-0 is between 2 and 3. How much lower would that be with these measures in place? We don't know, but the achieved RS value would determine what percentage of the population that eventually becomes infected. Next episode, I will talk about the World Health Organization's guidelines for what needs to happen before we can reopen the economy. And as best as I can tell, this level of lockdown that we're looking at will be somewhere around 2 months. And what James just described, as far as washing our hands a lot, not shaking hands, wearing face masks, opening businesses as possible, keeping the home sick, that's probably around 18 months. So again, this is going to significantly and forever change our culture, hopefully for good. Back to James. Let's assume that we flatten the curve so systems aren't overrun, then we gradually reopen, but keep some mild social distancing in place for the next year until there's a vaccine. And let's assume that by using this mild social distancing, we can achieve an RS of between 1.1 and 1.5. Now that's over 1, so we might assume that we end up back to the worst case scenario, but we don't. With an RS of 1.1 to 1.5, the tipping point for herd immunity moves substantially. Now the expected deaths is somewhere between 149,000, 149,000, and 4.4 million. By far the largest unknown driving the deaths in that scenario is the death rate. If it's 0.5%, then there are between 149,000 and 547,000 deaths. If the mortality is 4%, then there are between 1.2 million and 4.4 million deaths. Statistics don't care what we think or believe, and neither do viruses. So this is why this is globally impacting us so much. I think this is key. Even those claiming the unrealistically low mortality rate of 0.5% are talking about hundreds of thousands of deaths. With no social distancing at all, between 821,000 and 1.1 million deaths, and with mild social distancing, 149,000 to 547,000 deaths. This is why I call COVID-19 World War III, because this is a world war. And it's best case world war because this is humans against a virus. I've called this a very polite apocalypse. Not at all to minimize the trauma and grief and distress of the deaths. I just think this is the best case chance of us working together as humans. I'll talk about the downside next episode, but I really believe in the ability for this to be good. Things are somewhat better if you can drop the RS down to 1.025 and 1.075, and we end up with between 40,000 and 916,000 deaths. Conclusion, herd immunity can augment social distancing, but if the achieved RS value isn't either below 1 or at least very close to it, then the numbers dead are still very large. This is a good place to remind us that disruption is the most reliable catalyst for change. As I said, I'll talk about this next episode, but as the stock market has fluctuated, like 10 people have earned $5 billion or something insane like that. But what I'm hopeful about is that this problem is going to persist long enough that it will break our current global exploitative, unsustainable system. So there's your COVID check-in. Deep breath, feel motivated to be as careful as you can. Let's now get into house church. For the hymn, I recommend Jesus Once of Humble Birth. I have linked to a BYU men's chorus arrangement of that was performed at General Conference. And please pause the podcast, look that up, and enjoy that. This hymn gets at the powerful contrasts that Benjamin emphasizes, as I'll discuss shortly. And now for the prayer. You'll notice that I pray along with the theme of the lesson. It's a powerful practice, and I recommend that we all follow it. Our dear Heavenly Father, we are humbled at this time by this global pandemic that is upsetting our social order, inviting us into deeper introspection, deeper mindfulness. We pray that will increase our faith and our ability to use every challenge and trial for our good and for our growth. We pray that this experience will transform our nature, that it will draw us together, it will strengthen our relationships. Please bless the first responders and all of those impacted directly by the virus. Please sustain them and help them be as healthy as possible. Help them care for themselves as well as possible. Please inspire and motivate those in a place to donate needed personal protective equipment and other materials to those in need. Please inspire and help each of us do whatever we can in our sphere. As we begin this lesson, please bless us with the humility and honesty and courage and fortitude to wake up and feel and lean in to greater levels of sensitivity and even suffering, or pain rather, so that we can wake up and allow this discomfort to change our characters. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. For the sacrament, if you can pause and administer that, if you have the opportunity to, I would invite us all to reflect on our human nature and our shortcomings, love and compassion, and resolve to do better this week. I've shared this on the podcast before. I call it the human side of the atonement. And what I have found to be most helpful is an approach I call redeemed realism. And I'll get into that more in just a moment, where I have found we are commanded to have a broken heart and a contrite spirit. But what is it that breaks our heart and renders our spirit contrite? I believe it's what King Benjamin is talking about in these chapters. And in my experience, what has broken my heart is a deep awareness of my human nature and the fact that no matter how hard I try, I'll get it wrong. And no matter how hard I try, I'll hurt people. And that's why we need to transition away from perfectionism to redemption. Perfectionism is, if only I try hard enough, I can get it right. And in my past, my core unhealthy narrative has been, if only I'm good enough, people will love me. That comes from being abused as a child. And early young love will say, oh, honey, I'll never hurt you. I'll never betray you. I'll never lie to you. Well, we all know that's not true. It's not realistic. And this is why from primary, the gospel teaches a different approach. And this is the meaning of the sacrament. This is the meaning of the scriptures, is the deep awareness, again, that no matter how hard we try, we will always fall short. And this is what I think God is talking about in Ether 12, where God says, I will make weaknesses strengths. Because if we have a proper relationship to our weakness and to our fallibility, then we access redemption. We become humble, we repent, we forgive, and we have this soft, open orientation and alignment to life in each other that enables love and grace to reign. So the lesson of God and humans, I want to talk about the condescension of God, human nature and divine nature, which is my favorite topic, serving humans and serving God, damnation, exclusivity, interconnection, and then I will give the devotion and conclude. The condescension of God, I was really struck by the power and contrast and parallelism in Mosiah 3, 5 through 10. For behold, the time cometh and is not far distant, that with power the Lord omnipotent, who reigneth, who was and is from all eternity to all eternity, shall come down from heaven among the children of men, and shall dwell in a tabernacle of clay, and shall go forth amongst men, working mighty miracles, such as healing the sick, raising the dead, causing the lame to walk, the blind to receive their sight, and the deaf to hear, and curing all manner of diseases. And he shall cast out devils, or the evil spirits who dwell in the hearts of the children of men. And lo, he shall suffer temptations and pain of body, hunger, thirst, and fatigue, even more than man can suffer, except it be unto death. For behold, blood cometh from every pore, so great shall be his anguish for the wickedness and the abominations of his people. And he shall be called Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Father of heaven and earth, the Creator of all things from the beginning. And his mother shall be called Mary. And lo, he cometh unto his own, that salvation might come unto the children of men, even through faith on his name. And even after all this, they shall consider him a man, and say that he hath a devil, and shall scourge him, and shall crucify him. And he shall rise from the third day from the dead. And behold, he standeth to judge the world, and behold, all these things are done, that a righteous judgment might come upon the children of men. It's such a powerful teaching that the God of the universe was incarnated into a fragile, vulnerable, fallible human being. I don't know what I think about the purpose of all of this being for righteous judgment. We can come back to that. But this is the core of Christianity, is that God became human so humans can become God. That's a distinct emphasis in LDS doctrine. but the divine became human so the human can become divine. Absolutely. That is a common theme in all of Christianity and pretty much all religion. The purpose of all religion is to align humanity with divinity. I'll say that again. The purpose of all religion is to align humanity with divinity. Human nature. So now from the question of God to the question of us. My greatest interest is the intersection of religion and human nature, which is so very pertinent to these chapters. What does it mean that the natural human is an enemy to God? Mosiah 3:19. This is one of the best known and I think the most often misunderstood scriptures. The natural human is a stranger to God. Or more accurately, each of us as human beings have a mess of tendencies, inclinations, and cultural conditioning that invites us both toward and away from God. As I've shared in prison and elsewhere, one of the central things I've learned is that life and God are always inviting us into genuine growth, seducing us to cheat, and genuine growth is so hard that all of us will cheat as much as we can until we can't get away with it, usually from the teachers of pain and consequence. I have just summarized the entire human experience. For us to be reborn, reprogrammed, we could say, we need to submit to this gospel process. I like thinking of our brains as hard drives, our cultural conditioning as our operating system, and what we choose to learn and do as programs we install. And we'll talk more about this next episode, but the purpose of the gospel is to reprogram us into saints, to reprogram us into children of God. So our brain, the hard drives of our brain, we have about 4. We have our lizard brain that is focused on survival. That's why when you're woken up in the middle of the night, you're like, who's there? And you're ready to like punch them in the face because that's the survival impulse. And then there's the mouse brain, which seeks comfort, warmth, food, and so forth. There's our monkey brain that seeks relationships. Monkey see, monkey do. That's why we do bad things that other people want us to. And then the human brain, our prefrontal cortex, is the logical, strategic thinking and problem solving. And we literally have these layers of brains. If you look at reptilian brains and mammalian brains and primate brains and human brains, creation has built on all of those until the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinky bits. And it's, so here's the thing, it's a hierarchy of needs. Unless our needs are met, we can't really think as a human. And this is why caring for ourselves is so important, because we need to properly care for ourselves so we can be our best selves. We'll talk more about that. Summary of this verse, Mosiah 3:19. Our natural way of being is in opposition to the nature of God and needs to be trained, transformed, reprogrammed. We become what we practice. And we are always training ourselves and others. We need to turn from toddlers to saints. Toddlers want to get what they want pretty much at any cost. They only, for toddlers, only their feelings and needs matter. If toddlers don't get what they want, they will throw a temper tantrum. Toddlers usually can't delay their gratification, etc. Just anyone who's put a toddler into a car seat when they don't want to be put into a car seat, just meditate on that. My favorite way of thinking about this summary of human nature is that we are small, selfish, and social. This is my commentary on Mosiah 3:19. We are small, meaning we're limited. We get overwhelmed really easily. One of my favorite quotes is, "Don't attribute to malice what stupidity can explain." But even better than stupidity, I like limitation. More than anything, when we behave badly, it's because we're overwhelmed. And so we slip into reactionary behaviors and bad habits. And one of the main things that I've done in chaplain training is I've trained my own reactions and my own feelings so that I can sit with pretty much anyone through pretty much anything without freaking out. So like I have trained myself and I am grounded and rooted and calm beyond what I imagined even possible so that my response does not contaminate and interfere with the people that I'm helping. So we need to manage our overwhelm. And life is very much like a weight that is too heavy to pick up, and so we avoid it or strain ourselves or try to get someone else to pick it up. Again, we need to manage that overwhelm, and that's why we need to engage with this gospel training process. Selfish. Our own perceptions literally imprison us. One of my favorite aphorisms is perception is hallucination and memory fiction. Our brains literally create a hallucination based on limited data from our senses. How it works is our predictive brain pulls only enough data from our senses to keep us alive, for us to survive. And so it's literally a hallucination based on our fears, biases, and so forth. Our own feelings and thoughts and views are the only way we can access our world and the reality and the human experience. So a self-centered perspective on life is the only one we have access to. But wait, there's a shortcut. There's a path to redemption. And this is why I say we are small, selfish, and social. And it's our social nature that is at the root of our transformation. We are pro-social creatures. As E.O. Wilson and others have talked about, we as human beings are the only beings, animals, whatever you want to call us, who cooperate flexibly in large groups. Other animals such as wolves or orcas cooperate flexibly in small groups. Insects are the most famous animals that cooperate in massive groups, like unreal cooperation, but they cooperate inflexibly. So we as humans are the only animal that cooperates at a scale of thousands, even millions, flexibly. It is our superpower. It's also why we're destroying the world, because we are alpha predators in groups. So individually we are incredibly weak and insecure, and in super groups, super organisms, we are powerful enough to change the world. So that is human nature. Our social nature is the secret and the path to redemption. Treating people as people, treating others as real as ourselves is how we become the children of God, how we become like God. We learn that others matter. We learn that others have different experiences, that others have different perspectives than we do. We learn to take those differences seriously, and therefore we learn to love and cooperate. We practice love and cooperation. Just this morning, I was helping one of my friends who has some very bad tendencies, and he's really hung up on the concept of respect. And I told him, put it down, don't worry about it, just work on you. And a summary of my entire approach to human nature, besides the right relationship, right target, right order, right work that I've talked about, is live with proper form. And I think that is a summary of the gospel. Like the gospel teaches us to live with proper form. And I have found it incredibly satisfying and peaceful to focus on living with proper form. And when I live with proper form, I feel peace of conscience, no matter what happens, no matter how others respond. Serving humans and serving God. Mosiah 2:17-19. And behold, I tell you these things that ye may learn wisdom, that ye may learn that when ye are in the service of your fellow beings, ye are only in the service of your God. Behold, ye have called me your king, and if I, whom ye call your king, do labor to serve you, then ought ye not to labor to serve one another. And behold, also I, whom you call your king, if I, whom you call your king, has spent his days in your service and yet has been in the service of God, do merit any thanks from you. Oh, how you ought to thank your heavenly king. This is a logical argument called a fortiori, so much more so. So that's the argument he's making. He's saying, if I, as your king, have behaved this way, then how much more should you treat God this way? And, if I, as your earthly king, do merit thanks, how much more does God merit thanks. It's also worth commenting that the way Nephite society is portrayed, and one thing that has really struck me this last read through is that Nephite society is incredibly rigorous and even incredibly punitive. Lots of people being thrown into prison, lots of dissensions being quelled. It seems that Nephite society was pretty harsh, and that would have impacted their conception and framing of God. There are also interesting Near Eastern parallels of collective identity and so forth. That's why an entire household was considered one unit, and in the New Testament we see entire households converted. In the ancient world, especially in the ancient Near East, there wasn't this hyper-individualism that we have, which is like Greek on steroids. Yeah, thinking about that. Okay, what are the principles in these verses? Live with gratitude, work and serve with a feeling of gratitude rather than entitlement or resistance. Society is incredibly backwards right now. We have reversed the law of the harvest. We are debt-driven, we are consumeristic, our entire global economy is built on waste, like unsustainable waste. Whereas I love that old saying, what is it? Use it up, make it do, or do without. Like I love that old World War II concept of you have what you have and you make it do. During quarantine, like others, I've been minimizing the time I've been going shopping. And so I've been eating a lot of like cabbage and potatoes and soups and grains. And it's been really, really interesting. And I have felt connected to my grandparents. There was the normal food storage room and the scary food storage room. And the scary food storage room had like these ancient pickles and peaches and stuff that we never touched. But in the past, always, there was a very, very strong like root cellar culture and canning and juicing and drying, because for most of history before refrigeration, you had to make it do, prepare. You had to plant in the spring, work hard the entire season, harvest in the fall, preserve everything that you harvested in the fall, and prepare for winter. This agricultural process teaches us the gospel. It teaches us that we need to think ahead, prepare, work hard without gratification, do the right thing, do correct principles, and then when we do get to harvest, not use it all at once, not waste, prepare for the future, prepare for the next year. And again, in our consumerist, debt-driven society, I'll talk about this next episode, but I finally set up a finance app, Mint, which looks fantastic so far. We'll talk about being wise stewards of our resources next episode. Okay, so the target is to get to the point where serving God and serving each other is equally important, feels the same, and we have the same degree of motivation to care for ourselves, care for each other, and so we are like serving the God within us, serving each other as potential gods, children of God, however you want to think about that, however it resonates with you. Next, I want to talk about exclusivity and damnation. Well, maybe not want to, but it's in the chapter, so I have to deal with it. I have to admit that I was troubled returning to these chapters, as beautiful as I found them to be during previous readings. And I think the biggest difference is my experience as an interfaith chaplain. So let's talk about damnation and exclusivity for a moment. For both of these, I'm going to apply my usual functionalist order of operations approach. Damnation. I actually really appreciate the passages on damnation. In fact, I think Mosiah 2:37-38 is one of the most helpful explanations of hell and damnation. The idea of burn in hell forever is really bad. Devilish, you could say. When I taught world religions, I would challenge my students and I would say, we should remember that eternal damnation doesn't really exist in Latter-day Saint theology. I mean, maybe outer darkness, but we don't know much about outer darkness. I personally think the best interpretation of outer darkness is you get recycled. The telestial kingdom, we learn, is this world. Like, really interesting stuff. So this idea that hell is kind of a literal barbecue, like a soul barbecue forever, the only conclusion that I can come up with for that, which we don't believe in, is either God is a sadist or impotent. Either God wants their children to suffer forever, or they can't prevent their children from suffering forever. Either way, it's just not very palatable. Whereas this verse teaches a very healthy approach to damnation. Mosiah 2:37-38, I say unto you that the one that doeth this, the same cometh out in open rebellion against God. Therefore they listeth to obey the evil spirit, and becometh an enemy to all righteousness. Therefore the Lord has no place in them, for he dwelleth not in unholy temples. Therefore the one that repenteth not and remaineth and dieth an enemy to God. This is the part. The demands of divine justice do awaken their immortal soul to a lively sense of their own guilt, which doth cause them to shrink from the presence of the Lord, and doth fill their breast with guilt and pain and anguish, which is like an unquenchable fire, whose flame ascendeth up forever and ever. Now, Doctrine and Covenants 19, there's such good stuff in Latter-day Saint theology, if you know where to look and if you know how to put it together, which is the point of this podcast. You're welcome. Doctrine and Covenants 19 teaches that eternal punishment is the punishment of the Eternal One, not necessarily punishment that never ends. I don't believe in an inefficient God. So this clearly defines what burning in hell means. Not literal eternal burning, which, as I said, is a horrific thought, but a natural consequence of waking up to the harm we have caused to ourselves, how out of alignment we have become. Most humans survive life through avoidance, distraction, and deflection. Remember, as a hospice chaplain, my job is to help people come to terms with their lives as they're dying. And end of life is very much like Judgment Day in multiple ways. You figure out how you feel, you figure out where your relationships are, you figure out whether your affairs are in order. It very much is a Judgment Day. And then I also deal with prisoners. I've shared before that I want to be a university military chaplain. That's where I feel called. But oh boy, this time with the dying and imprisoned has been such an amazing training and learning process. When I felt my call to ministry in 2013, I had this very clear intuition that I needed to serve among the dying and imprisoned. And it is so cool that I've now been doing it for 3 years. And I think why God guided me to the imprisoned and dying is because these human lessons, these lessons of the gospel, are intensely required and play out intensely with the dying and imprisoned. I know that my own greatest pain has been realizing that I hurt others, often despite my best efforts, and being forced to become fully awake and sensitive. And I can imagine, so a gift of mine is that I already am hypersensitive and overthinky. And so I have just been able to make peace with this degree of pain. I can imagine how being forced to become fully awake and sensitive and not being able to do anything about it, realizing it's too late, would be a lively pain indeed. And even in prison, this isn't exactly the case. Ironically, the greatest irony in prison that I've noticed is that as a society, we treat prisoners with a higher level of rehabilitative investment than we treat citizens. So we invest more time and money in trying to help the worst of society get better than we try to help average citizens get better. So how could we talk about damnation? I find it most helpful to talk about damnation as an orientation, an alignment, the way we face and the way we are headed in life. One of my favorite teachings is the path of salvation and the path of damnation, and the emphasis that this life is not only part of eternity, but the most urgent stage of eternity. Every day, every moment, we are living salvation and damnation to different degrees. I understand salvation, becoming like our heavenly parents, as maximizing love, joy, peace, freedom, and growth. Salvation is the maximization, the embodiment of love, joy, peace, freedom, and growth. Damnation, therefore, is avoiding these. Damnation is losing ourselves to hate and avoidance, to misery, to anxiety, to bondage, to stagnation. So that's damnation, like in the healthiest way that I can think of it. I also think the gospel and temple teach progression between the kingdoms, as I've explained before. The most urgent and important target and focus is how we are progressing towards salvation now, and in a very real way, how we are experiencing salvation and damnation now. Again, this is the point of the podcast. Like, once there's this framing, this healthy framing, I think all the scriptures become clear and coherent. This is the task of the podcast, is to prevent a coherent approach to Latter-day Saint theology and Latter-day Saint scriptures in a way, as best as I can carry out, that coheres with science, social science, reality, history, ethics, and so forth. That's what I'm trying to do here. Okay. So the first urgent step, as the angel told Benjamin, is to wake up, to literally wake the hell up, because this is what's at stake. I feel so intensely that it hurts pretty much constantly, including pain over mistakes I have made. I have a functional photographic memory, both intellectually and emotionally. It's not pleasant. Taking accountability and accepting and applying feedback is a superpower of mine. When you know better, do better, as Maya Angelou says, that's a superpower of mine. It's made all the difference. I'm so grateful for it. I was talking to my prison lieutenant about this just yesterday. It hurts, but it's efficient and worth it. Wake up, let yourself see your faults, lean into the pain, and this will trigger growth and transformation. Exclusivity. King Benjamin's sermon, and it's been one of my favorite, but this time I read it with the eyes of an interfaith chaplain. I had a lovely talk this week with the chair of the Salt Lake Interfaith Roundtable about meeting prisoners' religious needs. So being an interfaith chaplain has changed my soul in really good ways. Some of the teachings in these chapters are only beautiful and uplifting if you already believe in them. You may ask what other option there is, and it's precisely the one that I stress again and again. This is what the Olam Institute does. Have you ever wondered? I say that this podcast it is put on by the Olam Institute. This podcast is the main thing that the Olam Institute does. The Olam Institute tagline is "Heal the world through religion done better." And I am increasingly convinced, and I am dedicating my life to the idea that there is a way to live religion that is so good that it can't lose. And so as an interfaith chaplain, I nurture approaches to religion that are so demonstrably good that you don't need to rely on the truth claims of that religion to justify behavior. Because I think the biggest danger of being a member of the church is that if we aren't careful, everything can become conditional. We need to take seriously that current Latter-day Saint culture teaches that temple recommend holding members of the church is the only valid way to be human. That's where the weight of the investment, that's what it teaches. We need to be careful around that. And again, there are so many wonderful, beautiful messages that teach different things, but we need to be careful about this. So as I said, some of the teachings in these chapters are only beautiful and uplifting if you already believe in them. I deeply believe there's a win-win approach to religion that uplifts and brings us closer to God no matter what we believe. So that's what I'm dedicating my life to. So here's the key question. Can we worship, follow, and come to Christ without knowing we are doing so? Can we worship, follow, and come to Christ without knowing consciously that we are doing so? I think the scriptures make the answer clear that it is yes. We need to take seriously the horrors. So let's talk history for a minute. History and the present to a degree. We need to take seriously the horrors that have been committed in the name of Christian exclusivity, bringing the gospel to the benighted masses. I'm listening right now to the book The Brothers about the Dulles brothers who were Secretary of State and CIA directors, respectively, and the influence of Christianity on their lives and on American foreign policy is really scary. We can live the gospel in such a way that our beliefs and practices lead us toward good and growth. I think the way we approach order of operations when it comes to exclusivity or the path to salvation is one of the most urgent. So again, just to state very, very clearly, all you need to do is look at a history book. So many atrocities have been committed because of Christian exclusive truth claims. The idea that we need to share the Christian message with the entire world very quickly has become we need to share our culture with all the world. We need to make everyone else like us. We have the truth of the salvation, therefore we have the truth, therefore we live in the right way, therefore we can take whatever we want. This is just history, and this is human nature, and we need to take it seriously. So what's a healthy look at a way to look at exclusivity? I think it's connected to human nature, another theme of these chapters. Benjamin stresses that Jesus is the only way that every person on the earth will learn about Jesus, and everyone who does not accept Jesus will be damned. So true or not, focusing first and foremost on that point can backfire. Yes, you can get some fear-based conversion, but that's not the best way to go. Most seriously, as I said, prioritizing exclusivity encourages some of the most harmful consequences of religion. When we are convinced we are right, we often aren't very good because we feel that our rightness justifies any approach, that the ends justify the means. This is pretty literally Nazi ideology. Nazis carried in their pocket Nietzsche and the Gospel of John. Just history. When we are, when we're convinced we're right, it nurtures, it facilitates, incentivizes these really ugly, scary, demonic aspects of human nature. So we need to take seriously the harm that has been done in the name of Christianity, and then we need to do better. One of the most interesting principles I learned in chaplain training is the process of triangulation. So there's you, the person you're talking to, and the issue you're talking about. If you pound on the issue, you weaken the relationship between you and the other person, and you strengthen the relationship between you and the person. So the traditional approach to missionary work is we are right, we are right, we are right, we are right. We have a bit of a caricature, but not too much. You know, we have the true message, we have the truth, learn the truth. And missionaries and the rest of us can tell you that that actually puts people on the defensive. It weakens the relationship between you and the person because they're offended that you're telling them you're right and they're wrong, and it strengthens their relationship between them and their current relationship. I remember talking to a Catholic on my mission, and I was like, "Ben, well, what's the true church?" And she's like, "La mienne." And you're like, "Mine is true." So what's a better way? If you focus on how everyone who does not accept will be damned, you are actually increasing resistance and decreasing effectiveness. So this is the path to missionary work that I think is being increasingly emphasized in the church, and I'm very, very grateful for that. I love Elder Uchtdorf's quoting of St. Francis of Assisi. President Monson also quoted it, where he says, preach the gospel always, when necessary, use words. So the most powerful and effective missionary work is our own behavior, our own lives. So the path to missionary work, the path to exclusivity that I propose is meet and love people where they are, learn about and respect their beliefs, teach them the principles of the gospel, help them live the principles of the gospel, and then they will come closer to God and become like God in the way that works best for them. And that very well may be becoming a explicit Christian or member of the church, but it also may not, depending on a lot of factors. Is it possible, coming back to this question, that Jesus will embrace those who never knew him, bless them for living the gospel, and in that moment they will recognize him? I think that's what many scriptures in the gospel teaches quite clearly. So in summary, with exclusivity, even if we concede that Jesus is the answer for everyone, this is the whole point of temple ordinances. People will live out their lives according to the truth and knowledge that they have, and when different beliefs collide, this is the most effective way to build relationships and even convert people. This is one of the great paradoxes of human nature, is the best way to change someone is by loving and respecting where they are, including you. The best way to change yourself and improve yourself is by accepting and loving yourself where you are and then moving forward. Interconnection. Why is dust better than humans? Sounds like a Book of Mormon joke, doesn't it? Because it obeys God. As we read in Helaman 12:7-8, this is Mormon. Oh, how great is the nothingness of the children of men, yea, even they are less than the dust of the earth. For behold, the dust of the earth moveth hither and thither to the dividing asunder at the command of our great and everlasting God. I love how in the Book of Abraham creation myth, as agency and complexity increases, it gets more and more difficult for the gods to obey. And that's the background of, I think it's Abraham 3:25, where it says, we will prove them herewith to see if they will obey us. That's the great quest of life, is to follow the principles of goodness. I love these verses about God sustaining us from moment to moment in Mosiah 2:20-21. I say unto you, my brethren, that if you should render all the thanks and praise which your whole soul has power to possess, to that God who has created you and has kept and preserved you, and has caused that you should rejoice, and has granted that you should live in peace one with another, I say unto you that if ye should serve him who has created you from the beginning, and is preserving you from day to day by lending you breath, that ye may live and move and do according to your own will, and even supporting you from one moment to another, I say, if ye should serve him with all your whole souls, yet ye would be unprofitable servants. This scripture is one of my anchors for my favorite interpretation of the atonement, which is, because the atonement is out of time, we are still in Gethsemane. And I love this idea that Jesus is literally keeping our bodies and our souls together. That's my interpretation of lending you breath and, preserving you from day to day, is that it is through the power of the atonement that we can literally live and breathe. And that is the mechanism, or an interpretation of the mechanism of the atonement, is that Jesus is literally living all of our lives and deaths. And then all of that was compacted into the Gethsemane and cross experience. So that's extrapolation, make of it what you will, but it's coherent to me. One of my favorite terms is biosphere. Life only thrives because of how the interconnected web functions. We are interdependent at every level. Earth without humans would thrive, but Earth without insects would shut down very, very quickly. We are all interconnected and interdependent. This period we are now living in is called the Anthropocene because human activity is endangering this interconnected web of life. I've linked to the Smithsonian article on this in the notes. One blessing of this pandemic is that we are feeling and experiencing how interconnected we are. We have to work together. I think the internet has changed the world more than almost anything else because we can see and talk to each other. We can experience each other's perspectives like never before. So this is our target. Serve God, serve our fellow humans, serve life. It is all the same. We are all one. For the devotion, I want to share one of my favorite poems by Mary Oliver, one of my favorite poems, which is by Mary Oliver. The last 2 lines have helped me practice compassion toward myself and others. This question is up to each of us to answer. No one else can do it for us. Summer Day by Mary Oliver. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean. The one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down into the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? I love that. And I love that poem because I feel it brings together a lot of the principles that we talked about in these chapters, where we can reverence nature and creation. And as an interfaith chaplain, I bear my testimony that it is possible to live the gospel and serve God, serve Christ without knowing it. I mean, that is one interpretation we come across a lot, is that whenever people worship God in their own way, they are worshiping the God that exists. Like, that makes sense. That's logically coherent. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Engaging Gospel Doctrine House Church. Thank you for your patience. I feel really good about this episode. Thank you for those who are supporting the podcast. I will talk more about podcast sustainably next episode. So as I said, I'm going to get this episode posted, then I will record the Olive Tree Jacob 5 episode, and then in the next day or 2, I will get right into the episode so we have at least a week buffer, and I will keep moving forward and putting out quality content. So thank you, all of you who make that possible.